Bueno, buenos días, bienvenidos.
Good morning and welcome.
De nuevo empezamos
Welcome
esta
back.
sesión
And we're going to begin
sobre
this next
economías
session
en
on
Oriente
the
Medio y Norte de
economy
África,
in the Middle East and North of
atrapados entre los
Africa,
hidrocarburos y la pared.
trapped
Hemos
between
tenido el honor
hydrocarbons and
de
the
moderar
wall.
y compartir
And
la
it's a
mesa
pleasure
con
for
la
me to
sesión
moderate
que
this
tenemos
session.
hoy. Mi nombre es
And
Olivia Orozco,
I'm
yo coordino el departamento
Olivia
de
Orozco, and I'm in charge of the Department of Training and Economy in Casa Árabe. And if you don't mind, I'm going to speak in English now, because my co-panelists will be speaking English. And
so my name is Olivia Orozco. I'm coordinating the education and economic program at Casa Árabe. And as you know, this is a forum that is celebrating our 10th anniversary. So from the economic program, since 2007, we have been following up and analyzing the last developments and evolution of Arab economies in this period through our series of publications, conferences, and seminars. As in the socio-political arena, in the economic field, we have seen also many changes and transformations, as well as continuities. We could link with the previous session in the sense that we have been witnesses important changes at the economic field, as well as continuity at other levels. When we started in 2007, we arrived just on time to see the last developments of the so-called third oil boom, which was from 2000 to 2008. So learning from previous experiences of oil booms in the region, as you know, the Gulf economies were dedicated to diversify their economies and were involved in, and have been involved since then, in impressive development processes, building new industrial and education cities, ambitious and sophisticated projects, turning into global financial and logistics platforms, and connected Asia and Europe with new airlines. So that's one of the new changes we have been observing. As in other cases, the oil-led growth period led also to kind of general economic expansion and development in all the MENA region, with some exceptions. So we saw how liberalization policies were introduced, opening up their economies and increasing their connection with international markets. Some countries climb rankings in doing business reports, like Egypt. Others, as we saw yesterday, were models of macroeconomic stability, like Tunisia, or were signing advanced free trade agreements with European Union, or like Tunisia as well, or with the states like Morocco and Jordan. So then we saw also the impact of the global economic crisis in the region from 2008 to now, basically, which affected primarily those Arab economies more connected with the international markets, especially international financial markets, like the Gulf economies, but also those countries depending more on export tourism and remittances from the European countries, like North African countries. So the Arab Spring came in 2011, and we saw how the so-called demographic dividend that we were talking about yesterday as well turned into a democratic wave, but also brought important issues into the table and some of the latent problems underlying Arab economies and societies, like structural unemployment, lack of future opportunities for the youth, nepotism, chronic capitalism, and corruption. In these last years, instability and conflicts have badly affected the Arab economies in general, and we saw how the impact is especially some sectors which are very important for some of the economies in the area, like tourism or industry and finance. In the current context with low oil prices, it's really changing the economic agendas, especially in the Gulf, when many projects and development programs are frozen, and it's making future economic scenarios difficult to predict in the moment. So that's where we are now, and after these 10 years, and after so many fluctuations and changes in certain areas, we see as well that no big lessons have been learned in terms of what is affecting really the main economic model followed by most of countries in the region. And here I'm going back to some of the aspects mentioned with Professor Uda Abdelhalik presentation yesterday, who was mentioning that it's still the economic model in Arab countries remains based on rent seeking and rent distribution, no matter where those rents come from natural resources or other sources. So in that sense, if we're speaking of rentier states in the Arab world, we're basically, of course, speaking about oil and gas, since in that sense, Arab countries represent around 44% of our world oil revenues and 31% of oil production in the world, and 28th or 29th of gas reserves and 16 of the gas consumed in the world. So in that sense, despite all the diversification program that we have been seeing all these years, still oil has the highest share in Arab economies, as mentioned, and Arab economies are being the less industrialized region in the world, as was also mentioned yesterday. So in that sense, today with the session on MENA economies between hydrocarbons and a hard place, we want to pose the questions of is it oil the problem? Is it a rentier state? Is it true that hydrocarbons are not a blessing, but also a curse? Or is it the globalization and the competence from Asia, which is really kind of pushing back the economies in the Arab world? And what are the missing factors? What we economists have been missing in our analysis of the region? And that's something that we will see today. Or how can we finally see any structural transformation, or the structural transformation that is really needed in the MENA countries to create productive economic system that create employment and growth for the majority of the population. So to answer, I will try to answer some of these questions. We come today with two exceptional speakers. We have here Hassan Hakimian, which is director of the London Middle East Institute, an MBA Al-Haber reader in economics with reference to the Middle East. Previous to his current position, Hakimian was an associate dean at Casa Business School, City University, where he led international business education programs in China and Middle East. And his research has been focused on the Middle East and covers human resources and demographic change, labor markets and employment policy, and globalization and economic integration. He's the author, among others, of Labor Transfer and Economic Development, and co-editor of the State and Global Change and Trade Policy and Economic Integration in MENA. So his research fellow at the Economic Research Forum, which is one of the main networks of Middle East economies based in Cairo, and is also an active member of the Middle East Economic Association of the USA. So we will start with him, and then I will introduce our next speaker, which is Miriam Lowi. I will introduce you now, and then I will leave you the floor now, because Miriam Lowi is professor of comparative and Middle East politics at the College of New Jersey. A native of Montreal, Canada, she received her MBA in history and economics from McGill University, and her MA and PhD in politics from Princeton University. Her research and writing has been focusing primarily on the intersection between natural resources and political behavior. She has written extensively on conflict over scarce water among adversarial states in the Middle East, and on oil and instability in Algeria. Her current project, for which she was named Carnegie Scholar, looks at the impact of oil wealth on the way Gulf Arabs live as Muslims today. Her major publications include Oil, Wealth, and the Poverty of Politics, Algeria Compare, and Water and Power, the Politics of a Scarce Resource in the Jordan River Basin. So I'm going to give them the floor. They will speak for 20 minutes, maybe a bit longer, but no more. And then we will open the floor for questions from your part.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and my usual thanks to Casa Árabe for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk to you. This session is about the oil sector, and therefore I'm going to be taking a look at how the long-term dynamics of converting oil resources to a pattern of growth that is more inclusive may be addressed. Yesterday in the keynote address, we were told Tunisia is lucky because it doesn't have oil. In fact, there is a very broad literature looking at oil as a curse. Those of you familiar with economic literature know of the debate about oil curse in many different aspects and dimensions. I myself don't believe in that. I think this is far too popular, if not populistic, approach. I don't believe, I mean, to put it on the card, I don't believe there's any glory in poverty. The challenge is not to wish we didn't have the oil resources. The challenge is how, through appropriate discretionary policies, we can mitigate any downside effects of having riches that can be both used and, of course, abused. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is part of a longer-term research on inclusive growth. And I approach this from two perspectives. One is for today's panel, a specific focus on the oil economies of the region. Of course, the MENA region is much more than just oil. Not all economies in the MENA region are oil economies, but my focus will be on those economies specifically. The second one is there's a lot of soul-searching going on after the uprisings from different perspectives about what happened, what went wrong, and could we have predicted some of these uprisings. And my own profession, economics, has been no exception to this. I've written parallel, as part of a parallel research program, which relates to this, on why economists as a profession actually failed to predict the Arab uprising. Economists are not best known for their prediction powers. They missed a wide array of big crises, including the global financial crisis, and you could argue that political, social crises are the preserve of political scientists. But I think that is being far too kind to us because of the type of policies that were prescribed, especially by international development agencies, and given the rather positive press they were giving some of the autocrats just before their downfall for following through the prescribed policies, I think the crisis was what went wrong from that perspective. I want to readdress that question and, in a sense, look at it from a different perspective. Now, inclusive growth means different things to different people. In fact, it's a very popular term, and it has acquired new currency. But when you look at the dynamics of the relationship between economic growth and efficiency, this is an old debate. In fact, if you go back all the way to Adam Smith, in this quotation here, you'll see that the father of capitalism, the intellectual father of capitalism and economics science, admits quite openly that what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconveniency to the whole. So he acknowledges that it's important to consider both growth and well-being alongside. Now, in the Middle East context, of course, this has, coming to more recent years, added significance because of the uprisings. Inevitably, there's a lot of questions that are addressed at the level of could the growth experienced or the pattern and type of growth been such that there would have been less resentment and alienation? That's an interesting question, but what I want to do is also look at in what ways, although we are asking this question retrospectively, if we had a model of inclusive growth, first of all, what would that look like? And secondly, what are the challenges in making the transition to that type of growth? So with that those general remarks about the context and motivation, let me briefly go over to talking about what's inclusive growth, very briefly, and then present to you the results of a quantitative exercise I conducted to look at the empirical evidence regarding MENA economies in general, but focusing on the oil economies and their track record in the last 10 years prior to the uprisings, that's specifically 2000 to 2010, and then draw some lessons from that. As I alluded to, inclusive growth is a rather slippery subject. It's one which has a very wide appeal, and it's one that means different things to different people. But when you try and pin it down, it's very difficult to define what is exactly inclusive growth in a way that is accepted on a consensual basis. For instance, if you look at one of the widest definitions of inclusive growth given by Claassen in 2010, in its broadest sense, growth should be benefiting all stripes of society, including the poor, the near poor, the middle income groups, and even the rich. Now, we know that in practice, even when all boats rise, i.e. all those income groups benefit from growth, there are still inequities in the extent to which boats rise, and more importantly, they are perceived to rise. So there's the question of distribution and growth dynamics, or the trade-off. But that's rather too general, because we know that, you know, it is not possible for everybody to benefit from growth to the same extent. And if you did, that will effectively mean perpetuating income inequality as it is. Now, another approach could be rather narrow. We define inclusive growth as growth with distribution. But we also know that poverty and equity are multidimensional. It's not just about income and income distributions. We should be looking at non-income assets like education, like health. There's another tension within the literature which has evolved over the concept of inclusive growth, and that is one strand defines inclusive growth as being a set of opportunities that are opened up to all to take advantage of. Another one is focusing more on the role of the state in providing the leadership in ensuring those opportunities are real and taken, rather than rely on a trickle-down approach. So that's one tension. And yesterday, of course, we had a presentation on the safety nets and social goods, and that surely, by all definitions, must be an important aspect of inclusive growth. Social safety nets are essential for any modern system, including those that operate fiscal systems. There has to be some distribution for the protection of the poor and those vulnerable. I have some problem including, for instance, energy subsidies, which are the hugest form of social protection in the Middle East, as being social protection. I would, as a matter of statistics, exclude them from social protection, because there's nothing distributive, positive in distributing resources for the benefit of the rich that is both environmentally unfriendly and also waste of resources. But I would focus on real safety nets that are, for instance, providing poor access to food and education and water and so on and so forth. One last remark, it's not just, when you talk about inclusive growth, it's not just outcomes, but it's also the process. People will not feel they benefit from growth and prosperity if they don't feel actively engaged and having a role in determining the outcome. So that's another layer of complexity and challenge. Now, this is a very broad exercise. If in an ideal world we were to designate what inclusive growth is, I would, from my perspective, and I'm sure you may have your own, would want to look at those criteria that fit into economic factors, the social dimensions, political, of course, quality of governments and institutions, but I would also surmise that environmental considerations plus spatial aspects should be looked at. Now, I don't have the time, and there's definitely a serious shortage of data, but if you were to set up these two slides go together, and I'm not going to read through them one line by line, but if we were to set up a detailed menu of more specific indicators that would enable us to capture these broad categories, I came up with a list of 30. certainly data is not available for them, but they demonstrate how inclusive, how broad inclusive growth can be. Now, for a more manageable exercise, I focused on 8 areas. On the left-hand side, I looked at growth and its patterns, health and demographics, captured by 3 indicators, labor force and employment dynamics, another 3 categories, education, gender, environment, inequality, poverty, and governance. And of course, the quantity and quality of data for these selected indicators by me, and this is subjective, people can construct their own inclusive growth index if they wish, and methodologies would be different, I admit, but from around 214 or so countries that are included in the International Statistical Data Series, especially those provided by the World Bank, I whittled them down to 152, excluding those countries for which there are huge gaps. For instance, I mean, an obvious case is North Korea, smaller Pacific Ocean islands, and so on and so forth. And based on rankings, so this is a relative criteria, based on rankings of these countries regarding these 14 specific indicators fitting into those 8 broader categories, okay, so it's selective. The results for the Middle East, North Africa, indicate some very interesting lessons. Now, I don't know if you can see all these figures, but I'll do my best to summarize some of them. First of all, when you go beyond just consideration of growth and GDP, which is often focused on when talking about oil as a curse and the substandard performance of oil economies when it comes to outcomes. When you take a more holistic view, in fact, certain things stand out. Number one, with the exception of Tunisia and Jordan, which are in the top half, just over 50. This is an index that I've constructed, and then I've normalized it because the number of countries for which data is available is not the same in all respects, so you have to standardize to be able to compare the rankings. So Jordan and Tunisia are above the 50% mark, and most other Middle East countries fall below. So they're non-performers, really, by international standards, take into account relative performance of all regions, all countries for which there's data, and of which, as I mentioned, I have 152 included. The exceptions are the GCC states. And of course, these are very, very tiny states. They're very, very small, and they're hardly representative. And the largest one of them, Saudi Arabia, with an index of about 40-something, again, fits into the general category, which is below 50% threshold. This is also true of Iran, for instance. The lowest scores are explained for Iraq, predictably, and for Yemen. We should emphasize that the data period I looked at is 2 5-year periods within the first decade of the new millennium, so 2001 to 2005 and 2006 to 2010. I stopped deliberately at 2010 again to avoid any distortions caused by the disruptions. One other very interesting point about changes, the trend line over the 2 5-year period we see is that, and these are the numbers that I've circled, what is very interesting is, and this is where I'm coming to oil, the oil states actually show a deterioration in their inclusive growth performance between 2001 and 2005 on one hand, going forward to 2006 to 2010. And this is despite the fact that this period, as you mentioned in your remarks, especially from 2002, on the eve of the US invasion of Iraq, to 2008, experiences an unprecedented, historically unprecedented oil boom. As you know, oil prices reached a historical high of $147, $148 in July 2008. So you look at, for instance, Algeria, you look at Bahrain, Kuwait, look at Iran. These are the major oil states which experience deterioration in their inclusive growth index. Of course, the devil is in the detail. One has to look at how each one of these performances, rather their discrepancies, can be explained. Algeria, Bahrain, Kuwait, I mentioned, and the UAE, by the way, also feature amongst the worst. Equally alarming is perhaps their low ranking in terms of unemployment. This is something that was discussed at length yesterday. Youth unemployment especially. For instance, to give you one example, Saudi Arabia ranks lowest, that is the last, out of 153 countries for which I have ranking included in the data. Saudi Arabia is 153 out of 153 over this period for youth unemployment. And this is a rather general pattern, which is what really pulls down these economies. Other development dimensions, such as gender and environment, also do not help the performance of the GCC states. So despite their oil riches, there are major dimensions in which they need to make advances in order for growth to be inclusive. And I have to put in a caveat here. As I mentioned earlier, my calculation of inclusive growth index here is relative to performance of others. And this is to take care of business cycles. When everybody is doing well, you have to do even better to improve your ranking. And when everybody is going down on the business cycle, your performance will stand out if you're doing even worse than others. So it takes into account comparative performance. There are possible shortcomings, there's no doubt about it. With any composite or aggregate index, as I mentioned, the devil is in the detail. You have to dig out into specific context to see what explains the variations in performances. The choice of indicators, I was very clear and transparent. My choice of 14 indicators for 153 countries, broadly defined in 8 categories. My hope is that through a desire for developing better, more comprehensive inclusive growth indices, we develop the capacity to generate more comprehensive, higher quality and internationally comparable data across wider set of indicators. So this is the beginning of an exercise for what it is worth. There's always the problem of weighting. The 14 indicators here, I deliberately weighted them equally. I did not apply any particular weight. So growth in GDP has the same weight as gender inequality. But this is an exercise that would produce different outcomes in different hands, and that's a subjective issue. But one can look at different scenarios. It's not an issue. Let me now conclude. I have 2 minutes on my watch. I decided to make your job easy because I chair quite often, and I know how frustrating it can be. You sit here and you're watching your clock. I think this kind of exercise, especially when looked at the performance of oil economies beyond the common indicators such as GDP, does open up interesting perspectives. And it does remind us of a basic fact, and that is outcomes should not just be looked at in terms of standard indicators such as GDP, but also quality of growth, its sustainability, as well as the degree to which it benefits others should be taken into account. Now, the decade that I examined was a special decade because of the oil boom for the oil economies. And as we saw, when it comes to consideration of inclusive growth, the experience broadly was not particularly positive. And let me close by saying that this in itself, as part of the wider exercise I mentioned earlier as part of my research, does actually sheds an interesting perspective on the so-called perceived roots of the Arab uprising. And let me end offering you 2 narratives which may open up more space for discussion. One is going back to Aristotle, and he observes that in order to secure his power, a tyrant must keep the population in poverty so that the preoccupation with daily bread leaves them no leisure to conspire against the tyrant. So poverty locks up any opportunity for protest and social upheaval. This is Aristotle's perspective, not mine. It's a useful reminder. Fast forward a few centuries, quite a few centuries, an observation by the famous sociologist Tocqueville on the French Revolution, it's a singular fact that this steadily increasing prosperity, not poverty this time, it's the upswing of the business cycle, increasing prosperity, far from tranquilizing the population, everywhere promoted a spirit of unrest. So he explains the French Revolution not because of economic hardship, poverty, recession, downturn, but of rising prosperity. In fact, I would argue that these two perspectives are more or less similar. They refer to the relationship between political, social cycles and economic cycles, but on different parts of the cycle. And I'm happy to further expand on the implications of this in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakimian. You just raised the whole debate about democracy and development, what come first, or if they come together, which I'm sure will raise many questions from the floor. So we pass now to Professor Lowi.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this very enriching conference for including me. It's been really a very interesting day and a half so far, and I'm very honored to be among you. One of the shared findings of the social scientific literature on civil conflict is that uprisings tend to occur during times of severe economic downturn. And among the scholars who study rentier states, there are those who argue that oil and gas exporting states are especially prone to instability, and this is largely because hydrocarbons are non-renewable and international prices for them fluctuate. So given the persistence of low oil prices since the summer of 2014, these arguments may lead us to wonder what is in store for the Middle East region if the trend continues. But I want to point out, as my colleague has, that the Arab uprisings occurred on the heels of close to a decade of rising oil prices. In January 2011, oil prices were $100 a barrel, and they would hover around 110 for the next few years. Furthermore, uprisings occurred in oil-rich and oil-poor countries, and so, as others have noted at this conference, we need to dig a bit deeper when we explore the sources of popular mobilization and linkages between hydrocarbons and conflict in countries of the region. From my own research on Algeria and its descent into violence, I have found that civil conflict has little to do with oil or no oil, high prices or low prices, and everything to do with the way in which resources, economic but also political resources, are distributed. In other words, the Arab uprisings can be understood as responses to the distorted distribution of resources and demands for their redistribution. So I'm going to focus my comments today on distribution, on spending practices of local power holders, the political objectives and effects of their spending practices, and what the future may hold in store. To begin, in discussing spending practices, it's important to keep in mind that statism is a key defining feature of the domestic political economy of the Middle East, North Africa states. And what this means is that if we consider oil-rich states, for example, hydrocarbon revenues are in the hands of the state sector is large, it's powerful, it's omnipresent, and the state is the chief employer and source of largesse. Governments distribute revenues to society and in a variety of ways. And typically, education and healthcare are more or less free. Transportation is fairly inexpensive. States provide subsidized utilities and some staple goods. And there are additional goodies in some cases. But while large state sectors are characteristic of oil exporting states, they are also characteristic of oil-poor states in the region. But in those, non-oil sources of revenue are what they control, what they use for distribution, and what they essentially pillage for the enrichment of those in power and their cronies. And so we can think, for example, of phosphates in Morocco, the customs services in Tunisia under Ben Ali, etc. Other oil-poor countries like Jordan may use foreign aid to provide welfare and subsidize goods, but also to enrich the power holders and those closest to them. So across much of the region, statism dominates, and states tend to be patrimonial with variations among them. And that means that proximity to rule is a key avenue to success, and patronage and clientelism are prominent practices and key sources of regime stability. And so distribution is not egalitarian, rather it is exclusionary, it is selective. The state itself, that is the ruler and his entourage or the ruling family, has privileged and often unacknowledged access to allocations from the national wealth for themselves. And those segments of society that are closest to state power benefit disproportionately. And another indication of this distorted distribution is that some regions of the country benefit more than others. Now, in this context, economic policies, but also social and political policies, are meant, at least in part, to support and consolidate state power and shore up its legitimacy. And no doubt, funding the vast distributive systems and greasing clientelist networks require ongoing and uninterrupted sources of revenue, as well as the absence of other sorts of threats. In this context, however, in this context of a highly centralized patrimonial state, broadening the capacity and participation of groups and individuals is precisely considered threatening. And so, to varying degrees across the region, to the extent that a private sector has been allowed to grow and invest, it has tended to be restricted to elites. And policies have been enacted to tie business elites to the regime so that they may be entrepreneurial, but they won't become too powerful. And so we find that business elites become very rich, while small and medium private enterprises receive relatively little support. And these trends are more pronounced in the oil-rich states because the state's assets are that much greater and they derive from a single source. And hydrocarbon revenues are the principal tools not only for economic development, but also via distribution and repression for social management and social control. But remember, the political economies of oil-exporting states are said to be unsustainable. Nonetheless, these states have been slow to diversify, and this for a number of reasons, not least among them that, when they're comfortable, why should they change? But also many of the policies in place shore up the political economic structure. And they're not even inclined to engage in gradual and necessary reforms in periods of relative comfort. So then how do these states respond to political challenges? And we can think of political challenges as coming, one, from perceived internal threats to their rule, and second, from threats to their revenues, and therefore to their capacity to distribute. In terms of the perceived internal threats, let's look at the Arab uprisings. How did the oil-exporting states respond to that? And it's important to remind ourselves that by January 2011, hydrocarbon exporters had accrued a lot of money over the preceding 9 to 10 years of rising oil prices. Algeria, for example, in 2010, had more than $150 billion in foreign currency reserves, which was more than 10 times what it had had at the turn of the century, and it had a public debt of only 4%. And four of the 6 GCC states have huge sums set aside. The UAE, for example, in 2013, had more than $800 billion in its foreign currency reserves at that time. And the oil exporting states used this accrued wealth to confront their populations with both distribution and repression and deter political mobilization. So let me give you a better sense of this by looking first at distribution. From the spring of 2011 through 2013, Algeria increased state subsidies massively by about 60% and increased public sector salaries by more than 9%. Until spring 2014, it created lots of jobs in the public sector. The GCC states also raised public sector salaries, but also created tens of thousands of new jobs in the public sector at the same time as it was talking about needing to increase private sector activity. In Saudi Arabia, the government claimed to spend about $130 billion for social benefits, housing, and jobs at this time, which is an enormous sum for a citizen population of about 20 million. Well, what about investments in repression and other means of social control? We see in the oil exporting states this time both classic but also cosmeticized repression. In Algeria, for example, the state of emergency that had been in place since January 1992 was lifted in February 2011, and at the same time, the police presence in the streets of Algeria was expanded enormously. The regime also stepped up its efforts to keep social forces deeply divided, and it stepped up its discourse of fear related to the imminent threats from Islamism, terrorism, and foreign intervention, as in Libya next door. Saudi Arabia also invested in repression and social control. The regime first moved outside its borders, but with a strong message for the inside. It sent troops to Bahrain to put down the pro-democracy movement there. And the intervention in Bahrain and the sectarian discourse it has promoted was meant to deter national mobilizations in the GCC and, of course, at home in Saudi Arabia. Not long after that, the regime also passed a new terrorism law criminalizing any open criticism of the king, and we see similar laws across the GCC states around this same time. What about challenges presented by falling oil prices? How have the regimes responded to these since the summer of 2014? Well, let me begin with the GCC states before turning to Algeria. Initially, it looked like that at least 4 of the 6 GCC states could handle low oil prices for a while at least, and this because their national debt was really quite low, while they had very large reserves. In Saudi Arabia, for example, prior to the beginning of its military intervention in Yemen, public debt was less than 2% of GDP. And it was reported that its financial reserves in February 2015 were about $1 trillion. Now, as low oil prices have persisted, GCC states have reduced their energy subsidies, they've raised fuel and electricity prices, there are plans now to introduce a value-added tax, there's more talk about diversification and even privatization. We've heard about the partial privatization of Saudi Aramco. And there have been cuts to projects underway and talk of even more cuts in the future. And we'll see how far these cuts go. I want to point out, though, that just a few days ago, King Salman announced that he was reversing public sector pay cuts and reinstituting bonuses and special allowances to civil servants and military personnel. And these were measures that he had put in place just last September. He said now that the economy was doing better, and so he could reverse these cuts. What's the most likely impact of these plans for domestic peace in the Gulf? If we consider the value-added tax for a moment, its impact really depends on how high the rate is. A tax of 5% is unlikely to get people mobilized, but higher rates like those in Europe and North America may make a difference. But I strongly assume that the governments will avoid these higher rates. Another interesting way in which GCC states are responding to persistent low oil prices is by giving the impression that they are responding to popular demands by distributing social and political resources. So, for example, women in Saudi Arabia were allowed to vote in the 2015 municipal elections. In 2016, the UAE created a Ministry of Tolerance and Happiness. And this was just a few months after it had disappeared a very prominent Emirati economist, allegedly for his tweets criticizing President Sisi of Egypt. In other words, when the going gets rough, these regimes engage in more or less superficial window dressing, behind which they step up repression, sometimes in novel ways. What about the impact of low oil prices on the foreign engagements of GCC states? Well, I would assume that in terms of foreign aid, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE's assistance to Egypt that really does depend on their financial assistance for its economic lifeline, certainly since 2015. I assume that that will continue, although periodically they will cut off aid to Egypt to sort of wrap them on the knuckles when they either don't send troops to Yemen or else vote with the Russians in the UN Security Council. As for engagement in war, unfortunately, the persistent low oil prices have not been sufficiently consequential for the ongoing war on Yemen. Saudi Arabia and other GCC states remain deeply entrenched in Yemen. They haven't been doing war on the cheap. And so it seems that in the short and medium terms, at least, when Saudi Arabia and the UAE have important security concerns, money may not be such a big issue. So then, how threatening to state power and political stability is the fall in oil prices? And what can we expect in the future if oil prices remain low? Insofar as the first question is concerned, it really depends on how entrenched the state's power is, how the state responds to the fall, and what other resources it has and is able or willing to access. In the short and medium terms, the repercussions are far more consequential for Algeria, but also for Iraq and Libya. Given the extent of their dependence on oil, the shortage of other important sources of revenue, combined with a host of structural and institutional challenges, as well as political instability. In Algeria, it's interesting to note that by January 2015, 6 months into the fall in oil prices, hydrocarbon revenues had declined by 50%. And initially, the regime simply dipped into its reserves to cover the shortfall. And then last spring, when the fund had declined by more than 22% in less than a year, the government decided to finally pare back on some subsidies. And since then, it has increased prices, it has imposed a 10% increase on the value-added tax, it has cut back on imports, and also on some infrastructure projects. And there's talks of cutting spending further and increasing taxes, etc. And the regime is talking again about diversification, but the economic situation has continued to deteriorate, and at this point the Algerian government has less than 2 years left of reserves to use as a cushion. The effect of the austerity measures has already caused significant rumbling in society, not only among the most marginalized, but throughout the country, and even among some segments of the elite. And this is potentially very dangerous, especially since there is considerable political uncertainty. There's a parliamentary elections next week in Algeria, and there's an imminent succession crisis. And this, alongside the severe economic downturn, bring back memories of 1988 and the descent into 10 years of violence. But the real the other very difficult situations are that of Iraq and Libya, and if you would allow me a few minutes just to talk about them. You know, in Iraq, as at the time that oil prices began their fall, Daesh had been not only making territorial gains, but took Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, and this was a huge hit to Iraq because of the loss of economic output from this major city and the slowdown in oil production. You may also know that Kirkuk, which has, from which about 20% of Iraq's crude exports come from, also had significant cuts in its production. So there was a huge fall in revenues at the time when the costs of fighting Daesh were escalating, to say nothing of growing numbers of refugees, both internally and also from Syria next door. And so how does a government continue to pay salaries, cover its costs, and also realize production increases when it doesn't even control the entire country and there's not even a functioning federal system in place? In Libya, however, the challenge and the dangers are even more stark. There's no central government in the country, but rather there is a government in the east, another government in the west, and there is people loyal to General Haftar, also in the east. And even the government in the west, in Tripoli, is being contested by the former government of Tripoli. And so there is no central power. The power holders have only very constrained, geographically defined areas of authority. Even the national oil company is split with branches in Tripoli and in Benghazi in the east. And there are oil fields in the southwest of the country, in the southeast of the country, and in the center of the country that are connected to terminals on the Mediterranean, but the pipelines go through territory that's loosely controlled by different tribes or ethnic groups, and that stop oil flows periodically. And at the same time, you have a country where hydrocarbons constitute 98% of exports and 91% of government revenues. And in this kind of environment, whoever controls the oil is effectively in command. If you consider the oil crescent in the center of the country on the Mediterranean, control over that region has changed hands several times, twice just since September. At the same time here, you have low production because pipelines are sabotaged. You have low oil prices. You have also a worsening economic crisis. A decline in foreign currency reserves. In 2015, it was said that the current foreign currency reserves would disappear by 2017 or 2018. And this obviously represents a devastating prospects for the average Libyan, where we see economic despair, severe polarization, and a governance vacuum as a recipe for worsening suffering and certainly stepped up refugees flows. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.